we found out that GNC, the supplement company,
This is, you see these in malls everywhere, right?
everywhere, right? Hundreds. I think they might even have, thousands of retail locations across the country. But they have 83 different facilities on our military installations across the country, and they are wholly owned by the Chinese Communist Party.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown, but before we get to the interview, we'd love it if you'd hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review because we love your feedback. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works and how to affect real change. Without further ado, here's the interview. Congressman Pat Harrigan, thank you so much for coming on the Signal Sitdown.
Bradley, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So no one noticed this before you came to Washington, but apparently somewhere along the lines, somebody thought it was a good idea to allow a company with CCP links to sell health products to our troops.
Unfortunately, that's true. And we found out that GNC, the supplement company,
This is, you see these in malls everywhere, right?
everywhere, right? Hundreds. I think they might even have, thousands of retail locations across the country. But they have 83 different facilities on our military installations across the country, and they are wholly owned by the Chinese Communist Party. We just don't think that that makes any sense.
It doesn't make any sense. And this is because GNC is owned by a company called Harbin Pharmaceuticals.
That's correct.
And Harbin Pharmaceuticals purchased GNC in 2020. So you can, for those people who say it's not a big deal, you can say, well, maybe it's a more recent thing. But even before then, 40% of GNC was owned by this company. You're somebody who pays attention to how the Chinese Communist Party sticks its tentacles into its own companies and then to the assets of these umbrella companies. So what's the risk here?
I think the risk is too high to tolerate at the end of the day, right? We have risks associated with the potential information that they could collect from our service members. You've got service members who are walking onto these retail installations that are on a military base already. They already know they're in the military, or at the very least, they know they're contracted. They're cleared to come onto our base. They know what products they're purchasing. They know what physical ailments they might be having or trying to correct. GNC even offers free supplement consultations so that they can kind of do a deep dive into your health and array the best set of solutions for the maladies that you may have or be trying to correct. Depending on their physical location on our military installations, we have, at the very least, Fort Bragg, which is the home of our special operations forces, right? Some of our most elite special operators in the country are at Fort Bragg. GNC actually has 4 different locations on that base.
On Fort Bragg.
On Fort Bragg alone.
And Fort Bragg is, this Fort Bragg is what, 55,000-ish people?
Yes, it's the largest Army base in the country.
Like 10% of the Army.
That's right.
And then you add on top of that civilian folks and families. You're talking like 250,000 people who probably live on or around that base.
Or have access to
Or
it.
have access to it.
Yes.
And we thought this was a good idea. It's like absurd that we're even talking about this after 10 years nearly of President Trump changing the conversation vis-a-vis China, where the old guard used to think that if we just gave them low enough tariffs that they'd become this beautiful Jeffersonian democracy, and that has not been the tale of the tape.
Right.
But I want to return back to something that you said earlier on all this information that GNC can collect from its clientele and potentially making its way to this parent company, Harbin Pharmaceuticals, and potentially to the CCP. I mean, does the American people have recourse right now if that data transfer is happening?
Well, we've asked Attorney General Pam Bondi to look into this and identify if there is recourse based on a couple different conditions. The first condition is GNC sharing information back to the Chinese Communist Party? They say that they aren't. And forgive me if I don't believe them, right? This is like the TikTok argument. Actually, when we came out with this bill, GNC actually made a statement to Bloomberg, and they said, to effect, they said, our Chinese ownership effectively takes Americans' data security very seriously. And so it's like, okay, our Chinese ownership.
I'm sure they do.
I'm sure they do. Like, this is the TikTok, trust us. We're not doing anything nefarious to your kids with our algorithms or the data that we're collecting and sucking up to actually run our apps. So forgive me if I don't believe them, right? But secondarily, there was a federal filing with the System for Award Management back in 2022. And the System for Award Management is the system by which all federal contractors have to register and provide a lot of background data on their businesses. And in that filing, so again, post 2018 when Harbin bought 40% of GNC, and then post 2020 when GNC went bankrupt and Harbin came in and bought the remaining 60% out of the bankruptcy process. So after all of that, they filed in 2022 with the System for Award Management that they did not have a parent company and that they had no foreign ownership. We want to know why.
And that's something that the Justice Department needs to get into, as well as the oversight function of Congress.
That's exactly right.
But you mentioned this, that you have a piece of legislation. So there's executive remedies to this problem, and there's also legislative remedies to this problem.
Yes.
And it is called the Military Installation Retail Act. Tell us a little bit about what this legislation does.
Yeah, it's actually the Military Installation Retail Security Act.
Retail
so
Security
it's like
Act.
MRSA, right? So it's like this infectious disease that we just have to rid ourselves of, which is the Chinese Communist Party or other adversarial nations owning companies that are operating on our military bases. We have to disgorge ourselves of that. But what the Military Installation Retail Security Act does is it requires the Department of Defense to do a broad investigation into all of the federal contractors that are working on our military bases and make sure that they aren't owned by our foreign adversaries, right? And that list includes China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. It requires that broad analysis of what are called our exchange gosh, I'm forgetting the term now, but concession contracts. And so when a military base or installation wants to have private contractors come in and actually operate on the base, they sign what's called a concession contract. And these are contracts that are really not very well vetted, which is a problem in and of itself, but it forces a broad-based review of all of that. And then it provides actual teeth inside of the legislation to kick any private contractor that has lied on their information transitions or transactions to the federal government, the statements that they've made about their background or their ownership or their foreign ownership. If there's been any dishonesty there, it provides for the immediate ability to kick them off our bases.
And there has to be some sort of corporate level accountability for that, especially if there's been previous records of lying to the government about this. But I think, it seems like a common sense piece of legislation to me, but somebody might object, well, GNCs, I mean, it's a franchise. You're actually not punishing the CCP or Harbin. What you're doing is you're punishing the franchise owner on the military base. I mean, what do you say to those people who raise those types of concerns?
Look, I think we all believe in free market economy here in the United States. And we believe that, look, within reason, you have the right to sell your company to whoever you so choose. We just think it's a step too far to sell your company to the Chinese Communist Party and think that you should maintain the expectation that you can continue operating on our military bases. That doesn't make any sense. We don't need foreign-owned cash registers taking the credit cards of our military servicemen and servicewomen, having access to their data, having access to their commercial telemetry, and potentially doing nefarious things with those pieces of data. And we just don't think that kind of passes the common sense test.
Yeah, and I previewed this, you wonder why something hasn't been done about this already, given that Trump is kind of, reformed, reshaped, completely transformed the conversation that we have about the Chinese Communist Party and the influence that it has in the United States. I mean, what do you think was, did this just go unnoticed, or is there something more nefarious about Congress itself that, maybe Congress thinks that you want to keep the Chinese goods rolling into the country and everybody, stock market go up, their coffers get thicker and thicker and thicker, and they're happy with that exchange?
I think it was just overlooked. I really do. And you could see how it could happen, right? They were initially a U.S. owned, wholly owned company. And through a multi-year transition process and a bankruptcy, they became wholly owned by Harbin Pharmaceuticals, AKA the Chinese Communist Party. And there was just no mechanism there for it to get caught other than that registration that they made in 2022 with the System for Award Management. We want to know why they declared the information that they did the way that they did it, because we think it's very possible that they did that in order to evade any further scrutiny into their ownership, their structure, that might have raised somebody's eyebrows and says, we have a problem here. We need to look into this. We think it's very possible that intentionally they misled the government.
That transition that you talked about from an American-owned company to a company effectively controlled by the CCP is insane, and it's a story that you've heard all too often in the last 20 years. And I think it's an interesting asterisk or addendum to the conversation that we have about U.S. trade policy, where if the U.S. is buying lots of cheap goods from China in particular, well, capital is flowing from the United States to China, and that capital comes back to the United States in the form of imports of U.S. goods to China, but also later on in the form of investment, right? This is in part due to this imbalance that we've had with the Chinese Communist Party since it entered the WTO in 2002. One thing that I wanted to ask you about, though, since this is your first term in Congress, this is the first time that you've had an elected position. You represent North Carolina's 10th district. Green Beret, military guy, private sector. I mean, why politics? Why did you sign up for this?
Fall of Afghanistan. Yeah, when that happened, I genuinely believed we had condemned America to conflict. And if you want to be weak, you're going to fight. And we've been weak for a long, long time. And so as I see it, I've got two kids. They're 5 and 7. Names are Reagan and McKinley. Really good, solid Republican names, right? But two young daughters. And I think their generation is going to be perhaps the most challenged generation in the history of America. And they are going to have to do the hard work to actually earn back the reputation and character that we once had in this country, that we have lost over the last several decades. And that will happen, unfortunately, through conflict. And I want to make sure that we don't fight wars we shouldn't be fighting, but that we absolutely win the ones that we have to. And I think that as we see the world burn around us right now, President Biden allowed the world to light up on fire. But as President Trump tries to bring that temperature back down, and we're even seeing this in Ukraine today, right? He even said to Zelensky last week, he said, I might have to start dealing with Putin differently, right? One of the first things you learn when you walk through the gates at West Point, the first thing that they'll tell you is, never forget this, the enemy always gets a vote.
And that is, I think it puts a fine point on it, where there's just so much to do, and yet already so much has been done in these first 100 days.
Incredible.
Biden really put a lot of things on President Trump's plate. 100 days of President Trump, 117 days, I guess, of Congressman Pat Harrigan. This adjustment to Washington, I mean, what has it been like your first time holding elected office?
It's been very easy. Part of that is
which isn't a story you hear a lot from first-time Congress people.
No, look, I'll tell you this. Number one, I have a great team, and a representative is ever only as good as the team that he or she has. We have an absolutely phenomenal team. But second, I was talking to a member who's been here for a long time and came from the business sector, and he was asking me, how things were going. I said, gosh, it feels like it's just so slow up here. And he's like, Pat, the transition from business to government is like the transition from galactic to glacial.
Galactic to glacial. I like that.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, look,
Things move very slowly up here.
when we own our businesses, right, we identify a problem, we identify a solution, we implement the solution, we don't have a problem anymore. Up here in Washington, D.C., we identify a problem, we study the problem, we talk about the problem, we think about some solutions and pay to study the solutions. And maybe 5 or 10 years down the road, we might actually solve the problem. Meanwhile, 30 other problems came up that were progressing on the same trajectory of solving them in the next generation. And that's really frustrating.
Right. A committee on the problem, a committee on the study of the problem, a committee on the study of the committee. This is, I mean, you came to Washington with a bunch of new Republicans, and President Trump included in this to, I think, if you put it shortly, secure the borders, make sure that we're capable of defending them, and unleash American prosperity through sound energy, economic, and let's say governmental policies, which covers everything, but is right-sizing the federal bureaucracy, et cetera. Right, cutting the spending, getting the bureaucrats out. First 100 days. Trump has done a lot on that front. He has signed over 140 executive orders, which sets a record for the first 100 days of a presidency. And he signed 4 pieces of legislation into law. He signed the Lake and Riley Act. He signed 2 CRAs, and he signed, of course, the short-term CR. Of course, we'll talk about the legislative side in a second, but from the executive side, what do you think of these first 100 days of the Trump administration?
I think President Trump has executed exactly what he promised to do on the campaign trail. And I think it's awesome. He's done an absolutely incredible job with following through. And if you look at the number one promise that he made, really protect our nation, right? I think that's to me, that was the number one thing that he promised the American people, and very specifically shutting down our southern border. We had the Northcom and Southcom commanders come in and give posture hearing testimony as part of the National Defense Authorization Act process that we have on the House Armed Services Committee as we hash out the military's budget for the next year. And they came in and they testified that, and this was 3 weeks ago now, that they had reduced illegal crossings by 97% in conjunction with the Border Patrol. A couple days ago, that number has now been updated to 99%. I mean,
you know, it's exactly what he said in the first joint address, right? Like, we don't need a law. All we need is a new president. And these folks stopped coming. Why? Because the Biden administration was standing there saying, please come on in. Please come on in. And Kamala Harris saying, actually, maybe you shouldn't come, isn't going to convince them otherwise.
Yeah. And nobody wants to actually do the hard work of looking at the bigger picture and thinking and looking back in time. But the only conclusion that you can draw from this is that President Biden's willful neglect of the southern border was nothing other than that. It was willful.
It was willful, and it was a lot of a waving of a wand to let people in and give them protected status,
That's exactly right.
In violation of congressional statutes.
Yes.
I'm sure that you guys will be moving quite vigorously to hold the Biden administration to account through the oversight function. But first, one big beautiful bill, right? We talked about the need for a new president to shore up the southern border. 139,000 deportations. Yep. That's a good figure. It's not the pace that the administration needs to be at if it wants to remove only the people who came in during the Biden administration, which is kind of part of the Biden administration plan, of course. But you know, a lot of that is on your guys' plate now, providing money through the budget reconciliation process to make sure that you guys have the detention beds, that immigration customs enforcement has the agents that it needs, that CBP has the capabilities that it needs to stop this crisis in the first place. So here we are. You guys are supposed to have some sort of plan on the floor by either May 19th or by July 4th or something like that. We hear conflicting deadlines. Where do we sit with budget reconciliation? What is it like being in those conversations?
Let me go back to something that you said real quick. Beds, right?
Yeah.
So I had ICE come in maybe a month and a half ago and talk to my office about the funding requests that they need in order to actually house enough illegal immigrants before they deport them. And I talked to them and I said, you know, are the requirements that you have for beds, are those statutory requirements? Are those requirements of law for a certain standard that you provide, or are those agency imposed, or those self-imposed requirements that you have to have? Because they're asking for a lot of money. And look, we're going to give them money. This is very clearly the will of the American people. This is going to happen. But my point to them was, look, you sent 1.5 million of us to Iraq and Afghanistan for 20 years and made us live behind HESCO barriers, caged dirt, right, on cots. And that was good enough for the very best of America, right? Our troops deploying. Yet we're going to build these absolutely incredible facilities to house illegal migrants who do not have a constitutional right to be in our country before we formally deport them. I think we need to change those standards so we can lower that cost and more expeditiously get this done and not have these hangups. And that is not my lane in the House Armed Services Committee. It's not my lane on science, space, and technology, but I'm trying to convey that message to my colleagues to make sure that we are not holding ourselves up in executing the agenda that the American people voted for.
And as we said, 4 pieces of legislation. Some people are, especially folks in the corporate media, are saying, "Oh, this is a failure." Well, we've been pretty straightforward. Conservatives have been pretty straightforward with the American people from the start that this is going to get done in this large package.
Yes.
Right now, I think, as you said, everyone's pretty much in agreement that we need to rebuild the military and focus it on lethality, as Defense Secretary Hegseth has said time and time and time again. We need to provide that money and potentially a review of those processes for our immigration enforcement. But right now, the conversation is focused on the tax debate.
Yep.
How do you see that landscape? How do you see the tax conversation shaking out?
It's diverse, right? And it's the same conversation that happened back in 2017 with President Trump's original Tax Cut and Jobs Act, right? You have representatives that represent states that have high taxation at the state level. You have representatives that represent states that have very low taxation at the state, or no taxation at the state level. And so you have the historical SALT argument going on, state and local tax deduction, right? What is that number going to be? Is it not going to be anything? Is it going to be a really big number? I can tell you that my constituents in North Carolina do not want to be subsidizing, from a tax perspective, somebody's burden because they choose to live in a state that enforces high, unduly high tax on them, like New York, New Jersey, California, Illinois. My constituents are very, very clear about that. But also, looking at the big picture, we've got to get that one big, beautiful bill done. And at some level, we have to balance what can pass with, we have to make sure we get President Trump's agenda into place. I mean, our role in Congress, and you talked about 4 or 5 immigration bills, right? Come back to the original conversation. We didn't need any additional bills on immigration to actually control our immigration problem. We just needed executive action to do it. And we just had a different president. That's it. Bottom line, President Trump came in and enforced the law. He restored law and order at our southern border. Now we are working alongside of President Trump to give his fantastic policies the permanence of that law, and to also put some teeth into the law that will prohibit future leaders, whether that's at the federal government, the state government level, or local government level, from not enforcing the law in the future. Now that we know that that's the problem set that we really have, is people selectively choosing to not enforce the law. And so giving President Trump's agenda the permanence of law, that's really Congress's charter. And that's exactly what the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, the second version that we're passing through the reconciliation process, is Congress stepping forward and doing its role and fulfilling its responsibility to stand alongside President Trump.
I'm going to tie together, for our final thoughts here, I'm going to tie together the budget reconciliation process with another piece of legislation that you have, the Americans Act.
Yeah.
Budget reconciliation, as I said, is going to try to provide over $100 billion, I forget the exact total, to the administration to help rebuild the military. So much of it wasted, as you previously said, and your inspiration getting involved in politics in the first place, wasted in Iraq and Afghanistan, and given to the Taliban in the case of Afghanistan. And this other piece of legislation that you have, the Americans Act, is seeking to reinstate some 9,000 almost individuals who were removed because they refused to get the COVID vaccine.
That's exactly right.
The restoration of the American military. I mean, what is our current status? And with your new piece of legislation, plus what can be done in the budget reconciliation process, where do you think we can get to in a 5-year time frame?
I think we can get to where we need to be, right? I think it's possible to correct the wrongs of the Biden administration, right? Through the Americans Act, we set out to correct one of the very egregious wrongs that I saw happen to our military, which was the politicization of a vaccine mandate for political purposes and nothing more than political purposes, to purge our military ranks of folks who were actually willing to stand on their morals and not bend the knee or have a jelly spine and squish under the strength of a massive institution.
Right. It wasn't about the medication itself. It was done after it had been politicized, and knowing full well that these were folks who did not see the Biden administration's see the world from the Biden administration's viewpoint.
That's right. And they were kicked out of the military. They were deprived of their retirement. They were deprived of their education benefits. They were deprived of their health care. And in many instances, almost all of them actually, they were deprived of an honorable discharge. Good luck finding employment with anything other than an honorable discharge in corporate America. The Biden administration wrecked these people's lives, and it did it for political purposes. And that was absolutely unconscionable. It needs to be completely reversed. And thankfully, several days after we actually introduced the Americans Act, President Trump came in with an executive order directing almost everything that we had in the Americans Act to get implemented through executive policy in the Department of Defense. Now, there's one thing that's really important about the Americans Act that we want to see all the way through, and that's still valid. We want to see the decision of what vaccines actually go on the schedule for our servicemen and servicewomen. We want to see that decision taken out of DOD and the executive branch. We want to see that brought into Congress. And why that's important is because we want the broad consensus of Congress to decide what the schedule of vaccines for our military men and women should be, not any one single person that might politicize it in the future. And so that will prevent the future weaponization of any vaccine mandate against our troops in whatever future administration we might find. And Senator Ted Cruz, who introduced that legislation in the Senate, and I, who introduced it in the House, want to see that provision through. That is very, very important that we don't allow that to happen again to another generation of service members.
So something old, something new.
Yeah.
Something old being it's already been done by executive order, but codification is always a good way, as you said, with the tax conversation, right? We got to make things permanent if we can. And that, I think, decentralizing that vaccine schedule, actually bringing that to the halls of debate in Congress is crucially important. But I will return to what you said for our final question. You know, I think we can get to where we need to be with respect to revitalization of the American military. Speak a little bit more about what that actually looked like. Is that lots of new ships? Is that advanced drone technology? I know President Trump is having us build a new fighter jet, etc.
Yeah, the answer is yes, right? It's all the above. We have very clear problems with our defense industrial base. We've become very good at producing the high-cost problem to our enemy's low-cost solution. So we've been losing the economics of our wars for a long, long time. And by extension, we've been losing our wars. We have to flip that paradigm. We have to become much more principled in the very expensive, highly exquisite technologies that we develop. And if we assess that those don't give us a real strategic overmatch against our adversaries, we need to stop funding those things. Simultaneously, we have to invest in new technologies that actually give us that strategic overmatch. So nobody's saying, take away these dollars and throw them outside of DOD. What we are saying is, let's be better stewards of the taxpayers' money and actually get a solid return on investment for the American taxpayer that leads to a spot where we can actually properly deter or defeat China. So we have to go through the military's inventory of assets right now. And in my opinion, we have to do a full broad-based scrub on everything that we are having the American people invest in. And we have to ask two questions. One, did it help us win the last 30 years of conflict? The answer to that in almost every case is no, because we haven't won a conflict in the last 30 years.
That's a big no.
Right? And then second, we have to ask the question, does continued investment in this help us truly deter or defeat China? And if the answer is no, we got to make some very, very hard decisions, and we need to reappropriate those funds into things, capabilities that actually do. That's kind of the 1-2 step that's going on. We're getting $150 billion extra dollars in the reconciliation process. That is going to reinvigorate our defense industrial base, particularly with respect to ships and submarines and other military aircraft and ground combat vehicles that we're going to need in the future. Certainly missile defense, Golden Dome, the things that President Trump wants to accomplish for our national security, all new and innovative things. But then we've got to come in and we've got to clean out the bad in what we're already investing in to create another 100 or 150 billion that we can reallocate to really provide a significant mass of dollars that actually solve the strategic problems that we're actually facing right now, which are incredibly severe, and I would argue are the most severe that we've ever had since World War II. Mm-hmm. And right now, understanding that we are $36.3 trillion in debt, we've got a $1.8 trillion annual deficit. We have to be good stewards of the taxpayers' money. We also have to understand that as a percentage of GDP, we have never spent less money on defense than now since World War II. That's a huge problem. We're in a historic fiscal squeeze when it comes to defense, and we have to navigate those challenges.
Well, the first 100 days defined by fast executive movement, the next 100 probably defined by a more deliberative process in Congress where you guys are opening up the hood and seeing exactly what's going on with the engine of this country. So, Pat Harrigan, thank you so much for coming on the show. We appreciate you joining the Signal Sitdown.
Bradley, thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Signal Sitdown. Before you go, be sure to hit like and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you may be joining us. And please remember to give us a 5-star review. We not only love your feedback, but it really does help the show. Remember, it's your government, and together we'll expose how it really works. See you next time.